Morgue procedures have their sounds. In my 12 years on the job, I've learned them all. The soft hum of refrigerator compressors, the distant whirring of fluorescent lights, the metallic scraping of drawers. But the sound I heard that night in June of 2003, that sound did not belong to the world of the dead. My name is Robert Jenkins, and I worked as a mortuary attendant at St. Louis Central Hospital for exactly 12 years, 7 months, and 14 days until I tendered my resignation. I have a bachelor's degree in pathologic anatomy and a certificate in thanatopractice. Over the years, I had handled over 2,000 bodies and was considered one of the most experienced staff members in our department. I was often consulted by my colleagues in difficult cases, especially when precise identification of time of death or interpretation of unusual post-mortem changes was required. Prior to the events I am about to describe, I prided myself on my ability to maintain professional detachment. I had worked with victims of violent death, with bodies after prolonged exposure to water, with remains after automobile accidents and fires. Nothing threw me off balance. Perhaps that's why management often put me on night shifts. The morgue is especially quiet at night, and not everyone can withstand that oppressive loneliness. I found it a kind of meditative tranquility. It began on Thursday night, June 19th, 2003. I came on shift at 23 hours and 0 minutes, as usual. I checked the temperature in the cold rooms, reviewed the intake log, and noted that 4 new bodies had arrived during the day. 2 from natural deaths from cardiac arrest, 1 suicide, and 1 from a traffic accident. Nothing out of the ordinary. That night, I had to prepare the body of a 49-year-old man for forensic examination in the morning. Paul Rivera, killed in a collision with a truck on the interstate. Standard pre-training procedure: measuring and recording body temperature, external examination, photo fixing, taking fingernail samples and other possible physical evidence. At 0 hours and 30 minutes, I removed Rivera's body from cold room cell number 4 and moved it to the work table. The procedure took about 40 minutes. When I finished and filed the documentation, it was 1 hour and 17 minutes on the clock. Usually after that, I would take a break and go to the staff room for coffee. But that night, something kept me awake. Some kind of sound, so quiet that it balanced on the edge of being audible. At first, I thought it was the hum of the ventilation or refrigeration equipment. But the longer I listened, the more clearly I realized that the sound was coming from the back row of cold rooms. The ones we use the least because of their distance from the work area. Drawer number 7. That drawer was supposed to be empty. According to the log, no one had been in it for over 2 weeks after the previous deceased's body had been turned over to the next of kin. I double-checked the logbook, then the electronic filing system. All the records read, box number 7, empty. And yet I heard the sound, rhythmic, repeating every 3 or 4 seconds. At 1:45 in the morning, I decided to check the cell myself, even though part of me resisted the decision. We mortuary attendants are just as superstitious as the rest of us humans. We're just better at hiding it. I slowly approached cold room number 7. The sound had gotten louder. Now it was like a muffled tapping, or a beating. When I touched the handle of the drawer, my fingers left wet marks on the metal surface. I didn't notice that my palms were sweating. "Nothing's in there," I said aloud so I could hear my voice in the oppressive silence of the morgue. "System error. Refrigerator isn't working properly. I'll call a tech tomorrow." But I knew that sound. In 12 years in the morgue, I'd learned to recognize them all. and it was a sound I knew well. It was the sound of a person's heart beating when you listen to it through a stethoscope. At 1 hour and 53 minutes, I opened drawer number 7. The metal tray slid out with a distinctive rattle, breaking the silence of the room. I saw something that could not be there, the naked body of an old woman. No identifying ankle bracelet, no tag. There was no documentation that the body didn't exist, and it was breathing. Unnoticeable to the untrained eye, the movements of the ribcage were absolutely discernible to me. Slow but regular cycles, about 6 breaths per minute. I picked up an infrared thermometer lying on a nearby table and pointed it at the woman's forehead. 36 4/10 degrees, the normal temperature of a living person. There are certain constants in the world of pathology. A body kept in a cold room at -4 degrees for any length of time cannot have a normal body temperature. This is contrary to the laws of thermodynamics. A body declared dead and placed in a morgue cannot breathe. It contradicts the very definition of death. My hand shook as I pulled the stethoscope from my robe pocket. As I placed the diaphragm against the woman's chest, I felt a cold sweat cover my back. Through the diaphragm, I heard a faint but definitely discernible sound. Knock, 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 knock. 30 beats per minute, too slow for a living person, but quite impossible for a dead one. At 2 hours and 07 minutes, I backed away from the cold room and made a decision that would later change my entire life. I did not report the incident, did not call the doctor on duty, didn't activate the code blue for resuscitation. Instead, I slowly closed drawer number 7 and returned to my workstation. I sat there motionless until 2 hours and 31 minutes when the sound from drawer number 7 suddenly stopped. It was as if the tape had been turned off. At 2 hours and 35 minutes, I opened the refrigerator compartment again. The drawer was empty. I spent the next 4 hours methodically checking every cold room in the morgue, going through all the admission logs for the last month, examining all the electronic records in the system. Nowhere was there the slightest mention of the elderly woman I'd seen. According to all records, drawer number 7 had been empty for 2 weeks. And it really was empty now. When I was replaced by the day attendant, Thomas Greenwood, at 7:00 I said nothing to him about the night's incident. But before I left, I checked the temperature in cold room number 7, -4 degrees, normal. As I left the hospital that morning, I knew I'd be back the next night, and I knew I'd never be the same again. The next night, June 20, 2003, I began with a methodical inspection of each cold room. I arrived 45 minutes early for a more detailed inspection than usual. Pathologists treat their procedures with the utmost care. It's not just a professional habit, but a necessity when dealing with post-mortem changes. Every little detail can make a difference in determining the time and cause of death. I started by checking the temperature in each chamber. All readings were within the normal range of -4 degrees Celsius, with a tolerance of 0.2 degrees. Then I checked the entries in the intake log against the actual bodies. Everything matched, except for one thing. Drawer 7 was still listed as empty, even though less than 24 hours ago I'd seen the breathing body of an elderly woman in it. I muttered to myself, I'm just overworked, lack of sleep and excess caffeine, classic combination for hallucinations. At 23 hours and 15 minutes, I began my standard night caretaker duties, preparing bodies for the morning autopsy, documenting new admissions, keeping the room clean, routine tasks that used to bring me a strange satisfaction in their methodical and predictable nature. But now, after yesterday's incident, every step was an effort. I kept listening, expecting to hear that sound again. At 1 hour and 27 minutes, as I was completing the preliminary examination report on the body of a 62-year-old man who had died of heart failure, I heard it again. A quiet, rhythmic sound, as if a clock wrapped in a soft cloth was counting down the time. And the sound was again coming from drawer number 7. This time, I did not hesitate so long. With confident steps, I made my way to the refrigerator compartment, mentally preparing myself for the possibility that I would see an empty tray and the sound would be the result of a malfunctioning vent valve or other technical problem. Refrigerator compartment number 7 slid out with a distinctive metallic rattle. I expected to see an empty steel tray. I was prepared for the sound to disappear as soon as I opened the drawer, confirming my theory of an equipment malfunction. But the crate wasn't empty. On the standard steel pallet lay the body of an elderly man, approximately 70 to 80 years old, with completely white hair and a wrinkled face. He was wearing a hospital shirt like an ICU patient. And what was most impossible was that his chest was rising and falling, barely noticeable, but regularly. I recoiled from the cell, knocking over the tool cart behind me. The sound of falling metal echoed through the empty morgue room. My heart was pounding so hard that black dots pulsed before my eyes. I whispered to myself when I could breathe again, "This is impossible." Slowly, forcing myself to act methodically, I approached the box again. The man lay motionless, but his chest continued to rise and fall rhythmically about 14 to 15 times a minute. I took a pulse oximeter from a nearby table and attached it to the man's finger. The device showed a pulse rate of 30 beats per minute and an oxygen saturation of 87%. I repeated, louder this time, "That's impossible. The temperature in the chamber is -4 degrees. A person can't—" I didn't finish the sentence. Instead, I took the infrared thermometer and pointed it at the man's forehead. 36 6/10 degrees Celsius. Normal human temperature. Any first-year medical student knows that a body in a -4-degree environment for any meaningful period of time cannot maintain a normal body temperature without active metabolic processes and a functioning thermoregulatory system. In other words, a dead body cannot be warm in a refrigerator. In my career, I have twice encountered the Lazarus phenomenon, the spontaneous return of cardiac activity after death has been ascertained. But in both cases, it occurred within minutes of cardiac arrest, not days. And in neither case were the patients breathing without ventilation. As a shift leader, I should have called for a medical team immediately. This was a live person requiring emergency care. But something was holding me back, something on the periphery of my professional mind, some detail I was missing. At 2 hours and 11 minutes, I forced myself to check the tag on the man's big toe. The standard hospital identifier read, "William Stone, 79 years old, Department of Geriatrics, date of death, 15th of June, 2003, 9 hours and 22 minutes a.m. Date of death, 4 days ago." I double-checked the admissions log, this time for the last 2 weeks. William Stone was not admitted to our morgue, not on June 15th or any other day. According to our protocols, no body can enter the morgue without proper documentation. There is a strict record-keeping system that requires the signatures of at least 2 employees. I have personally processed every admission for the past 10 days, and not one of them involved a man named William Stone. I dialed the front desk of the main hospital building. Sharon Morris, with whom I had a friendly relationship, worked there on the night shift. I said, "Sharon, this is Robert at the morgue. I need some information on a patient. William Stone, about 80 years old, was supposed to be admitted to us after his death on June 15th. I heard the tapping of keys as she checked the database. Sharon replied, "Bob, we have no record of a patient with that name dying this month." I asked, "What about admissions? He could have been a patient in geriatrics." The sound of keys again. Sharon continued, "No, Bob, no William Stone. Not in geriatrics, not in any other department. Not now, not in the last 6 months at least. I could check further, but—" I interrupted her. "No, don't. Thank you, Sharon. I probably got the name wrong." I hung up the phone and turned to open drawer number 7. The man continued to lie there, his chest rising and falling in a measured manner. I carefully closed the drawer and sat down at my desk, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. 15 minutes later, I opened drawer number 7 again. It was empty. There was no sign of a human body being there, no shifting of the sheet, no condensation from breathing, not the slightest indication that anyone had been lying on that steel pallet less than 20 minutes ago. I spent the rest of my shift scrutinizing every inch of the morgue. I checked all 17 cold rooms, looked under every table, inspected every closet and storage area. There was no sign of an elderly man named William Stone anywhere. At 5 hours and 42 minutes in the morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the high windows in the corridor leading to the morgue, I did something I had never done before in my entire career. I falsified an entry in the cold room temperature log. Opposite cell number 7, I wrote, "Not functioning, maintenance required," and sealed its entrance with yellow caution tape. Before I left, I checked all the locks and the video surveillance system one more time. Everything was working properly. No one could enter or leave the morgue without my knowledge throughout the night. I whispered as I left the hospital at 7:05 in the morning. "I'm going crazy. It's the only logical explanation." But logic didn't matter anymore, not after what I saw in box number 7. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen on the night of June 19th was a hallucination caused by overexertion or perhaps by air pollution in the morgue. I even insisted that the air be analyzed for volatile components of formalin, glutaraldehyde, and other fixative agents capable of causing temporary perceptual disturbances during prolonged exposure. The request was made under the pretext of a routine check of the ventilation system. The results of the investigation showed concentrations of all potentially psychoactive substances well below the threshold level. Nothing unusual happened for almost a week after the incident. I continued to work the night shift, trying my best not to look at cell 7. My route around the morgue was adjusted to minimize my time near that cell. And perhaps I would have gradually convinced myself that it was all just a play of imagination if it hadn't been for the events of the night of June 26th. That night I came on shift at 22 hours and 30 minutes, half an hour earlier than usual, to take an emergency admission. A 40-year-old woman, Diane Morgan, had died during pancreatic surgery due to an anaphylactic reaction to anesthesia. The preliminary report was that an idiosyncratic reaction to propofol, an extremely rare but known complication, had occurred. Her body needed to be preserved for possible forensic examination in connection with a potential lawsuit by the family against the hospital. Andrew Pierce, the anesthesiologist who attended the surgery, personally accompanied the body to the morgue. This was unusual. It was usually handled by lower-level medical staff. Dr. Pierce was pale, with noticeable periorbital cyanotility, and his hands exhibited small amplitude tremors. Dr. Pierce said to me, holding out the papers, "I need you to personally follow up on all procedures with this body, and I want you to do additional tests for residual levels of propofol and succinylmethonium in the blood." I replied, accepting the paperwork. "That's standard procedure in these cases, Dr. Pierce, but actually, the tests are ordered by the pathologist at the autopsy, not me." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice taking on the tremulous characteristic of extreme anxiety. "I know the protocol, Mr. Jenkins, but there's a special case. I administered the standard dosage. Everything was within normal limits. Her reaction, it was, look, just make it as thorough as possible, okay?" After Dr. Pierce left, I performed the standard procedure of receiving the body and placing it in cold room number 3. On the pre-burial preparation charts, I noted the need to collect additional biological samples for toxicology analysis before beginning tissue fixation. I then made an entry in the logbook and in the electronic record-keeping system. Around midnight, as I was doing the paperwork, I heard it again. The same rhythmic sound, similar to a heartbeat. This time it didn't come from cell number 7, but from cell number 3, where I'd placed Diane Morgan's body. I froze, unable to believe my ears. Could it be imagination again? Perhaps ventilation or some other mechanical noise. But the longer I listened, the more distinct the sound became. The rhythmic frequency of about 32 to 35 pulses per minute did not match any of the mechanical cycles of the morgue's equipment that I knew of. And the sound was coming from the third chamber. At 0 hours and 17 minutes, I opened refrigerated cell number 3. Diane Morgan's body lay exactly as I had left it 2 hours earlier, but now her chest was rising and falling rhythmically. I attached a pulse oximeter to her finger. 32 beats per minute. A saturation of 85%, a value incompatible with normal bodily function, but also impossible for a person pronounced dead 3 hours and 42 minutes ago. At that moment, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Usually there was no one in the morgue but me at this time, but sometimes the doctors would come down to clarify some details about the bodies they had received. I quickly closed cell number 3 and turned to the door. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Pierce. I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice, "Doctor, is something wrong?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. The cold light of the morgue's fluorescent lights reflected in his pupils, giving his gaze a strange, hollow intensity. Dr. Pierce spoke softly. "You saw it, didn't you, with patient Morgan?" I felt a chill run down my spine, activating a primitive sympathetic nervous system response. "Saw what?" he replied, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a whisper. "You know, they're breathing. After we record death, they continue to breathe." My heart froze for a moment, then hammered with redoubled vigor. My throat was dry, and I struggled to squeeze out, "I don't know what you're talking about, Doctor," Dr. Pierce said with undisguised bitterness. "Don't lie to me, Jenkins. I saw it with my own eyes. In the intensive care unit, in the operating room. They record the patient's death. Cardiac arrest, no brain activity, all the signs. They're pronounced dead. A few hours later, they start breathing again. But they don't wake up. Never wake up." I glanced involuntarily in the direction of cold room number 3, a treacherous gesture that confirmed his suspicions. I asked, no longer trying to hide my knowledge of the phenomenon. "How long have you been noticing this?" he replied, checking against the notes in his notebook. 3 weeks, since June 8th. Then was the first time I noticed it. Since then I have observed the phenomenon in 7 patients. All of them were declared dead by all the criteria for clinical death. All began breathing again, usually 2 to 4 hours after death was pronounced, but none of them showed any signs of consciousness or brain activity on EEG. I asked the obvious question, "Did you report this to anyone?" Dr. Pierce laughed unhappily. "Who? The chief medical officer? Do you have any idea what would happen if that information got out? Mass panic, religious fanatics announcing the second coming, crowds of people storming hospitals looking for resurrected relatives." He was silent for a moment, then added more quietly, his voice taking on a tinge of paranoia. "Besides, there's something else, something I don't understand. The records are disappearing. Data on patients who exhibit this phenomenon are disappearing from the system. It's as if they never existed. It's as if someone or something is erasing them from reality." At that moment, I thought of William Stone, about how he wasn't in the hospital database, how he disappeared from cell number 7, leaving no trace of his existence. I said to Dr. Pierce, pointing toward cold room number 7, "Come with me. A week ago, I saw a patient here who didn't exist in the system. He was breathing too, and when I came back, the drawer was empty." We opened cell number 7. There was nothing inside, a sterile, empty cell, as if it hadn't been used in months. I said, heading toward cell number 3, "Now I'll show you something else." But when we opened it, Diane Morgan's body lay motionless. No breathing, no signs of life. A completely dead body, meeting all medical definitions of death. The pulse oximeter I'd attached to her finger less than 10 minutes ago was missing. For the next 2 weeks, Dr. Pierce and I secretly monitored the situation. I recorded all cases of abnormal post-mortem respiratory activity in a special logbook that I kept in my personal locker, separate from the official documentation. We compiled a detailed table of observations, including the time of death, the moment respiratory activity started and stopped, the measured vital signs, and all related circumstances. Analyzing these data, we identified 4 key patterns. First, the phenomenon was observed exclusively in patients who died within the walls of our hospital, not in subjects brought in with signs of biological death from outside. No body from the ambulance service or from the medical examiner's office exhibited this phenomenon. Second, the interval between the declaration of death and the onset of abnormal respiratory activity ranged from 2 to 4 hours, with the activity itself lasting no longer than 8 to 10 hours, after which all indicators irreversibly ceased. Third, when the subject was moved during the period of activity from the original storage location, there was a complete dematerialization of the body at the next examination, accompanied by a systematic deletion of all records about this patient from the hospital database and physical archives. Fourth, all patients who exhibited the phenomenon had a history of contact with staff or equipment in the new experimental wing where regenerative medicine research was being conducted under the direction of Dr. Malcolm Hayes, a specialist in cellular reengineering. By July 10th, we had recorded 11 cases of confirmed post-mortem respiratory activity. I noticed changes in the behavior of the night shift staff. Nurses avoided going down to the morgue. Orderlies refused to transport bodies alone, citing ventilation problems and strange noises. No one directly articulated what they may have observed, but the collective atmosphere of unease was becoming palpable. On the night of July 10th, 2003, an event occurred that finally destroyed my ability to rationally explain what was happening. I went on shift as usual at 23 o'clock. The morgue had received 3 bodies: an elderly woman of 84, Elizabeth Fowler, cause of death acute heart failure; a man of 27, Alex Rivera, victim of a car accident with massive head trauma; and a man of 43, James Hodges, who had died during an experimental stem cell transplant procedure in the new wing. The last body in particular caught my attention. The cause of death column read, "Unspecified cardiac arrest during the procedure." The resuscitation protocol indicated persistent asystole, not amenable to defibrillation and pharmacologic stimulation. I placed the bodies in cold rooms, Elizabeth Fowler in cell number 2, Alex Rivera in cell number 5, and James Hodges in cell number 7. Yes, the very cell where I first encountered this phenomenon. I did this intentionally, assuming that if location mattered, the phenomenon would be most likely to manifest at the site of previous manifestations. At 0 hours and 30 minutes, Dr. Pierce went down to the morgue, accompanied by 2 colleagues, Dr. Ellen Ramirez, a neurologist with a specialty in altered states of consciousness, and Dr. Michael Chen, a critical care specialist. Dr. Pierce introduced them, lowering his voice. "These are people we can trust. They've seen it too," he explained, gesturing toward Dr. Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez observed a case of a patient in a persistent vegetative state who was pronounced dead after 53 minutes of no electrical brain activity, but continued to demonstrate spontaneous respiratory movements after extubation. He then pointed to Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen recorded 3 cases in the ICU, all with an identical pattern: complete cardiopulmonary arrest followed, after an interval, by resumption of limited vital functions with no signs of consciousness. We set up an observation post with vital signs monitors for each of the 3 chambers. At 0 hours and 58 minutes, acoustic sensors registered a characteristic sound emanating synchronously from the 3 refrigerated chambers, numbers 2, 5, and 7. It was the first time the phenomenon had occurred simultaneously in more than one location. Dr. Ramirez whispered, looking at the readings on the monitors. "Oh my God, it's happening to all 3, synchronously." We opened cell number 2 first. An elderly woman lay with her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling evenly at a rate of 14 to 15 cycles per minute. Dr. Chen performed a quick assessment of the vital signs using portable equipment. He reported without taking his eyes off the monitor: pulse 30 beats per minute, saturation 84%, body temperature 36 5/10 degrees. Myocardial electrical activity is present but atypical. QRS complex is dilated to 140 milliseconds. An identical pattern was observed in cell number 5. An automobile accident victim with visually identifiable multiple facial skeletal fractures and signs of massive blood loss exhibited the same parameters as the first subject. When we opened cell number 7, there came a moment that forever changed my understanding of the line between life and death. James Hodges was not only demonstrating respiratory activity, his eyes were open, sclerae injected, pupils fixed in the mid-position, gaze directed directly at us, with no blink reflex or signs of focusing. Dr. Ramirez reflexively recoiled, knocking over a nearby cart with tissue collection instruments. Dr. Chen, displaying exceptional professionalism, immediately began assessing the patient's neurological status. He reported, leaning over the body, same baseline vitals, pulse 30, saturation 86, but there is neurologic activity. He pointed the beam of the ophthalmoscope at Hodges's pupil. Pupillary reflex present, The reaction is delayed, but definitely there. Dr. Pierce looked disoriented, his professional confidence completely shattered. This defies all criteria. I have personally verified the absence of electrical brain activity. 30 minutes of continuous isolinear EEG. At that moment, James Hodges' lips showed minimal motor activity, a barely perceptible contraction of the orbicularis oris that we would not have noticed had it not been for directed observation. A dry, fricative sound resembling the rustling of leaves escaped from his larynx. We froze in absolute stillness, unable to break the moment of impossible contact. The lip movement was repeated, this time with the distinct articulation of a single-syllable word. Hodges uttered, 7. Dr. Ramirez shrieked and began an involuntary retreat toward the exit. Dr. Chen dropped his diagnostic tools, reflexively jerking his hand away from his body. Only Dr. Pierce and I maintained relative immobility, paralyzed by a combination of professional curiosity and primordial terror. Hodges repeated, 7. His eyes remained fixed, directed into the space above us. Dr. Pierce whispered, "What is he talking about? What does that number mean?" I answered, realizing the horrifying implication. The cell number. He realizes he is in cell number 7. At that moment, Hodges uttered a phrase so quiet that we had to get close to his face to distinguish the articulation. He whispered, with pauses between words, "They know that we see." Synchronously with the last syllable, there was a total blackout. We found ourselves in absolute darkness, aware of the presence of the 3 abnormally active bodies and hearing their synchronized breathing, the sound of which now filled the entire space of the morgue. 7 seconds later, the emergency power system activated. The dim reddish light of the emergency lights flooded the room, giving all surfaces a tinge of caked blood. We immediately resumed our inspection of the cold rooms. All 3 were empty, without the slightest trace of the bodies we had seen less than a minute ago. Documenting pathologic phenomena requires extreme precision. That night, we compiled a detailed report 14 pages long, documenting every aspect of the observed phenomenon with chronometric precision. 4 signatures: mine, Dr. Pierce's, Dr. Ramirez's, and Dr. Chen's, certified observations that by all the laws of medical science were not supposed to exist. We recorded timestamps to the nearest minute, vital signs to the nearest hundredth, and, most disturbingly, a verbatim transcription of verbal contact with a subject whose brain had shown no electrical activity for 7 hours and 34 minutes prior to vocalization. On the morning of July 11th, Dr. Pierce personally delivered our report to the hospital's chief physician, Dr. William Foster. We expected professional skepticism, demands for psychiatric evaluation, administrative sanctions, perhaps even charges of violating body handling protocols. But Dr. Foster's response did not fit any of our predicted scenarios. Dr. Foster said, looking through the documentation and lingering his gaze on the transcription page, "Box number 7. So they've started talking." He then invited us to a private meeting later that evening. The meeting was not in the main building, but in the administrative block of the experimental wing, a location whose access was strictly controlled by biometric verification. I arrived at the designated location at 18 hours and 30 minutes on July 11th. The conference room, equipped with a Faraday cage-type electromagnetic shielding system, already contained Dr. Ramirez, Dr. Chen, Dr. Pierce, and 5 people I didn't know, who I later learned were ultra-high security clearance researchers. Dr. Foster began, wasting no time on procedural formalities. What you documented last night is part of a systematic phenomenon observed in our facility since May 15th of this year. Exactly 57 days. During this period, 34 verified cases of autonomic respiratory activity in clinically dead subjects have been recorded. 7 cases of verbalization, including yesterday's incident. He paused, appraisingly studying each of those present. Official administration position. The phenomenon in question represents an atypical pharmacologic effect of an experimental regenerative protocol. Temporary residual functioning of the autonomic nervous system induced by a drug to stimulate regeneration of nervous tissue. Situation under control. No potential threat. Dr. Foster took a deep breath, his professional mask contorted for a moment. But that would be a scientific falsification. We have no reliable information on the nature of this phenomenon. We cannot identify its etiology, and we certainly have no control over the development of the situation. The only verifiable fact is that this phenomenon is not confined to our institution. He activated a holographic projector showing a map of the United States with labeled locations. 27 medical centers register an identical pattern. All cases were initiated synchronously between the 13th and 18th of May. The pattern is universal. Clinical death, latency period of 2 to 4 hours, initiation of autonomic respiratory activity without cerebral correlates, dematerialization upon physical movement or instrumental intervention. Dr. Ramirez asked, her voice containing a mixture of professional interest and existential dread. What is the interpretation of this phenomenon? What is the mechanism of dematerialization? What is the ultimate localization of the subjects? Dr. Foster replied, we have no verified information. There are multiple hypotheses ranging from quantum biological to metaphysical. Some postulate the formation of an intermediate state of matter between the classical definitions of animate and inanimate. Others hypothesize mass hallucinatory convergence induced by an unidentified neurotropic pathogen. A third group theorizes about a fundamental change in the quantum structure of reality in which the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, creating an ontological liminality. I asked, seeking specificity. Why did the initiation take place in May of this year? Dr. Foster shook his head. There is no verified data. Perhaps the phenomenon has always been latently present, and we have only just begun to register it. Or there was a global event that changed the fundamental constants. In the absence of empirical data, any interpretation is speculation. Dr. Pierce asked a pragmatic question. What is the protocol of action for personnel with information about a phenomenon? Dr. Foster replied with carefully controlled neutrality. Officially, documentation without interference. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement with an omega-7 level of secrecy. You will continue your professional duties. Document new cases with no interaction with subjects and no discussion outside of this group. Federal agencies are informed and conduct a parallel investigation. Public disclosure is strongly discouraged due to the potential for mass destabilization. After the meeting, I spent a sleepless night analyzing the information I had received. 34 cases at our institution, 27 medical centers with an identical phenomenon, lack of scientific explanation. But most disturbing remained the verbal contact with James Hodges. They know what we see. The plural pronoun implied a collective consciousness or observer. The identity and nature of this entity remained an absolute unknown. I continued my professional activities in the morgue for another 14 days. During this period, I documented 5 additional cases of autonomic respiratory activity. As per protocol, I documented observations without instrumental intervention or interaction. On July 25, 2003, exactly 1 month after the initial observation of the phenomenon in cell number 7, I submitted a formal letter of resignation. This decision was not spontaneous or emotionally driven. 12 years, 7 months, and 14 days of professional identification as a thanatopractic practitioner had shaped my personality, social status, and worldview. But continuing to work in the context of the information I knew had become psychologically unbearable. Now, 6 months after the described events, I regularly experience sleep disturbances with a characteristic hypnagogic auditory component, rhythmic sounds of respiratory activity coming from empty space. I systematically monitor information sources for abnormal occurrences in medical settings. Periodically, fragmentary evidence is found, brief mentions in the regional press, anonymous reports on professional forums. But at the level of public discourse, the phenomenon remains unrecognized. I often reflect on the theoretical model proposed by Dr. Foster, the permeability of the boundary between the states of living and non-living matter, ontological liminality. And inevitably, I come back to cell number 7, to its special status as the point of primary manifestation, to the semantic significance of the number articulated by James Hodges before dematerialization. I do not possess scientifically valid answers to these questions. I am not sure I wish to have them. But one truth has become absolute. The structure of reality is fundamentally more complex than our conceptual models, and sometimes cognition is best confined to rational limits, without trying to look beyond the existential veil that separates our experience from what potentially exists on the other side of the biological dichotomy of life and death, especially if that which is on the other side begins to show signs of counter-interest in our reality.